Thank you, Roby. It's great to be here, to be in this setting and in this format, to talk about what for me has been one of the most painful and at the same time exasperating and frustrating national discussions in my lifetime. And what I'm talking about is the conversation around the events that occurred in Ferguson, Missouri on August the 9th, 2014. You all know the basics of that story, and the fundamental facts, of course, are that this is when a white police officer named Darren Wilson had an encounter in Ferguson, Missouri with an 18-year-old African-American man named Michael Brown. And at the end of that encounter, Michael Brown was dead. None of us knew much about it at the time, but we soon learned that there had also been an incident in the previous month in which a black man in New York City, named Eric Garner, had died after being put into a severe chokehold by New York City police. And then later we heard about other incidents that had echoes of these same things. All of which, in fact, though it wasn't talked about a lot of the time, were echoes of many other incidents that many of us recall. Trayvon Martin and many others, depending on how we define them, go far back in our memories and in our history. But the conversation that followed that event was one that was primarily around marches that began to happen in Ferguson and then in many other cities across the country. Deep arguments and such that went on radio shows and on television, in classrooms and in restaurants among all sorts of Americans all across the country. And I found all of that conversation to be boring. Fundamentally boring. Constructive in almost no way. My perception as that conversation was unfolding was that everyone involved, with very few exceptions, trifling, meaningless exceptions, but almost everyone involved sprinted for the standard corners of their debates and their fights. No one had anything new to say. Everyone was reacting off of scripts that we had all heard 1,000 times before. There was nothing original, there was nothing constructive, and the entire conversation went nowhere. Just as that conversation has gone nowhere time and time again in incidents before the ones that we focused on during those months. And so I was troubled and I was bored by that conversation. Because the conversation that I want to know about, that I want to be a part of, is not the one about the facts of each of those incidents. It's not that I don't care about those incidents. I do. I care about who did what, ultimately. But the question of whether a police officer should be indicted after he's been involved in a shooting of a civilian is not a particularly profound one in the end. The question of whether a citizen was engaged in criminal conduct that somehow then led to or contributed to a succession of events at the end of which that citizen is dead, those are questions of fact. Those are questions that need to be worked out. They're questions of whether the facts can be obtained and then the application of the law to those facts. Those are important things, but those are not very profound questions. They're tragic issues, tragic events, but they're not profound questions. The question that I have, the discussion I'd like to be a part of, and that I think Americans have deeply resisted for generations, is a much bigger question. And that's the question of why is the society, why does the society that we live in, why does it continue to set in motion these events? Why do we again and again create more Michael Browns and Darren Wilsons and Trayvon Martins? Why do we produce the characters who then are set on these paths, these dramas, that seem inevitably to collide with one another in such disastrous ways, tragic ways? Why does it happen over and over again? That's the conversation that I wish we could engage in, and that's the conversation that I think very few Americans really want to be a part of, particularly the people we've heard the most from. And so, to begin to approach that question, I think we have to understand the origins of what happened in Ferguson, Missouri. And the origins of that event are more than just who did what, who shot John, who shot Michael, or why Michael got shot. The origins are different from that. You might say that the origin is what the discussion was about, that that's what the debates were about. You might immediately assume that the origins of Ferguson are in some environmental explanation, that it stems from that a disproportionately large number of white police officers on a police force in the city that's majority black. Or that it has something to do with a childhood. I don't know if this was the case or not. but something in the childhood of a police officer, where he grows up less prepared for, he grows up in a world of white people who are not as sensitive to issues of race in America, and so somehow that has something to do with how he handles the situation when he approaches it at the age of 28. Or perhaps you would say it has something to do with a dysfunctional neighborhood, or the stresses and difficulties that a young African-American man grows up in, that somehow that is part of the explanation. And I don't know to what degree, if at all, any of those things were factors in what happened in Ferguson in August of 2014, but perhaps they were. But that, even if they were, for me that is still not the origin. That's not the origin of what happened on that day and the discussion that we ought to be having about it. To find the origin of this, we have to go back in time. We have to go beyond those events. We have to go beyond the lives of the people. We have to go beyond all of our own lives. We have to go beyond segregation and American apartheid. We have to go all the way back to the Civil War and beyond the Civil War and into the era of institutional slavery and all the way back to the very beginning of that. We have to go all the way back to that notorious day in 1619 when a pirate ship, really, it's not called that usually in American teaching of American history, but a pirate ship comes up the James River in the Virginia colony and arrives at the English colony of Jamestown and offloads there a cargo of human beings, men and women who had been kidnapped from Africa, originally destined to go to Mexico or the Caribbean or someplace further south than that, where slavery was already rooted and flourishing. But instead, by an odd sequence of events, they end up in this other place, unexpectedly, in Virginia. And there began slavery in America. But even that, for me, that may seem a little simple to say that's the origin of Ferguson, and it would be too simple. And I wouldn't say that's the origin. But the origins of Ferguson, in fact, come in what follows that event, and not the obvious of what follows. Because slavery didn't arrive in a prepackaged state in America where everyone understood what it would be and how it would play out and what a visceral and critical part it would come to play in the development of America and all of American life. In fact, when those black people came off that ship in 1619, the white settlers who were there didn't quite know what to make of these people or what their presence in North America would mean for them. Their sense of identity, their sense of how a person was defined or identified, had much more to do with the European traditions of national origin or specific locations, a city or even a valley that someone had come from, or faith. People identified each other as Englishmen or Scotsmen or Welshmen or Catholics or Protestants or Huguenots, Calvinists. In fact, even among some of these early enslaved people in Virginia, when many of them converted to Christianity, many were set free because of a notion widely held among those early colonists that it couldn't possibly be permissible for one Christian to enslave another Christian. The rules of the racial caste that came to dominate so much of American history, and we're still wrestling with today, didn't exist. Those colonists in Virginia had never heard the word segregation. They'd never heard the word white supremacy. They'd never heard of discrimination. The whole notion of discrimination based on race, the whole notion of race didn't exist in 1619. And it's not, surprisingly, it's not more than 100 years will go by before the rules of slavery and the rules of race in America begin to be clearly identified. And so in those early years, it is as likely that an enslaved person is a captured Native American as it is that they would be a kidnapped African, or the descendant of a kidnapped African. There are many free African people in Virginia in those early years. Some of them own other enslaved Africans in those very early years. And well into the 1700s, there are black people who are participating in elections in the early 1700s. And so the irony of that is that at the very same time that the American leaders who ultimately become our founding fathers, or our founding fathers become the heirs of their ideas, at the very time that these notions that will change so much of human history and our understanding of what liberty means and the intrinsic value of humans, at the very time that these notions of the Enlightenment are taking on a new and far more sophisticated, far more important place in the evolution of all intellectual activity by human beings, the very time that America is generating this extraordinary set of ideas, it is also at the same time inventing its own variation of slavery. At the same time, oftentimes by the same people. And because all this takes us to the most incredible paradox of all of human history. And that's the phrase from the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Now, that notion that all men are created equal is one that has confused modern Americans for generations. How could it possibly be that Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote those words, wrote most of the Declaration of Independence, how can it be that at the very time he writes those words, he, and along with the other founding fathers, is enslaving hundreds of people of African descent? And in fact, Jefferson, we know the details on him, but almost all the founding fathers, almost certainly, has a black concubine. He's not only enslaving laborers, he's forcing women to be his sexual servants. And how can it be that at the same time this is happening, the same person writes that all men are created equal? Well, the reason it's so confusing and the explanation for that has to do with our own misunderstanding of what those words meant. And understanding those words and what they meant at that time is critical to understanding much about the world we live in today. Because in 1776 and thereabouts, we think that the brilliance of our founding fathers was such that what they were saying was that all men are created equal. And that it meant exactly what those words would seem to suggest. And that would tell us that all Africans and all people in North America are equal, that all Frenchmen and all Dutchmen and all Russians and Englishmen are all equal. But that's not what it meant. That's not what it meant to them. What it really meant to them was that all Englishmen are equal. It meant that the Englishmen in America were equal to the Englishmen back in England. And even more revolutionary, more radical, it meant that they were also equal to their king. And so instead of that idea being one that's just about pure liberty and pure equality, it was, by another way of looking at it, an extension of royalty and royal status and the importance of royalty to every Englishman. It wasn't equality. It was the notion that all Englishmen, all white people ultimately of America, were royal and should have all of the same God-granted privileges that in the past had been designated to royalty or could only be passed on to common people either through a royal voice or through a priest. And so, what's the requirement, though, of if all of these people are royal? No one can be royal unless someone else is not royal. And so it became essential that there be a definition of other people who were not going to be royal and who, in fact, could not quite be human. And so it is in that need, the need for a reconciliation of this idea about the equality of all Englishmen, that a simultaneous need for this elaborate codification of race and slavery and discrimination and institutional injury to African Americans over the next 300 years is built. And so in reality, enslavement and liberty are opposing sides of the same coin in American history. And so for Americans in the early centuries, really, of our existence in North America, the European existence here, the extension of liberty, the idea of extending freedom to black people, or even a sense of equality to black people, or anyone who didn't appear to be white. The idea of extending that was not an expansion of liberty, but a violation of the American notion of liberty. Enslavement and degradation of certain people was a requirement of the most fundamental notion of American liberty. So what's the significance of that, particularly today? The significance of that is that in a world in which we revere the Founding Fathers, and I do as well, I'm fascinated by the brilliance of the Founding Fathers, by the sustained success of the ideas that they conceived, the way that the extension of liberty to far more people than had ever felt liberty before, even though they were excluding it from many others. Nonetheless, this expansion of liberty that they engineered did, in fact, alter the course of human history in unimaginable ways, altered the lives of billions of people over time, led ultimately to the creation of the superpower that the United States is today. So these ideas were profound, were astonishingly powerful, and we have to admire them. We also have to admire that the Founding Fathers were willing at that time to do something that's not easy to do, and that is they lived in what was already the most successful human society on the planet, arguably. They already lived in a place where more people within the British Empire had a kind of freedom than any society had ever allowed before. One in which there was more opportunity, more possibility than they had seen before. And yet, even in the midst of this most successful society, they were able to recognize the tyranny that existed within it at the same time, and to imagine a different society, a different world that they wanted to live in. And so, what is it about all of this that takes us back to Ferguson, Missouri, and the events that followed that? It is that we have to accept the idea that if it was the brilliance of the founders, that even today, the intrinsic value of their ideas that continues to explain the success of our society and the prevalence of the world's desire to be more like us in so many ways, which is still true. And I believe that to be the case, that these ideas are critical, were critical. Their inherent value was critical to the success of this country and human society. But if we accept that, if we revere the Founding Fathers for that, then we have to also accept that in this paradox, embedded in the most fundamental idea of American liberty, that paradox, that flaw, that imperfection, that perversion of the notion of liberty and justice, that too is embedded in the DNA of American society and is a part of the explanation for our failures, the places where things have gone wrong and continue to go wrong. And so the mandate on all of us as Americans today, if we revere the Founding Fathers, and if we are in fact concerned, as we all seem to be, about those events over the last 6 months, if that's the case, then we have to be willing to do as the Founding Fathers did. And that is, we must be willing to have that dialogue that we would prefer not to, because it raises such deep doubts and insecurities about our own society. But we have to be willing to have that society. We have to be willing to have that conversation and that debate. We have to be willing to acknowledge the depth of this flaw in the American creed, American psychology, and we have to be willing to imagine a future America that is different than the one that we live in, that addresses these things. And that is the society that I would like to live in, and that is the society not in which Michael Brown and Darren Wilson would never meet, but one in which perhaps they would meet again and again, but in very different ways. And that's the dialogue I would like to be a part of. Thank you.
Doug's an English major. I was an English major. How'd you like to get graded on a curve with them? I graduated though. It's good. All right, our final speaker today.